Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. My name is Ana Sangronis, and I work for the University of Florida IFAS Extension Service here in Miami-Dade County. This webinar series is a joint effort between UF IFAS Extension, Florida Sea Grant, and Miami-Dade County Eco Adventures. We will be offering this webinar series every second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. through December. Thank you very much for tuning in today. To save bandwidth, please leave your cameras turned off. Everyone in the webinar is currently muted, so we ask that you type any questions you may have into the chat box, which I will be moderating. There will be the opportunity for question and answer at the end of the session. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to you within the next week. Please follow us on social media, where we will be continuously advertising these webinars. If you'd like to receive an email reminder with the monthly topic and registration link, please email me or let us know in the chat box. Now I'm going to turn it over to today's presenter, Ed Pritchard of Miami Eco Adventures.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you all for joining us this evening for our second Conservation Conversations of 2021, fall 2021. We're excited to have you and talk to you guys about another conservation topic as part of our series. Tonight, I'm going to be presenting on Queen Conch conservation, and we will be having time at the end to answer questions. So throughout the presentation, if you want to enter that into the chat box, I'd be happy to answer those questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll quickly just introduce myself. So my name again is Ed Pritchard. I work with Miami-Dade County in their Miami Eco Adventures division. We do environmental education and conservation-based programs to protect and spread awareness about our local natural resources. And it's been great working with Anna and our UF IFAS extension, which is also a part of our Miami-Dade County Eco Division, to provide these programs and to work on a number of different initiatives to engage more with our populace to encourage protections of our natural resources. So again, tonight I'm talking about Queen Conch conservation. So a quick overview of the topics that we will be covering in this presentation. So I'll be starting off just talking a little bit more about the taxonomy and anatomy of this particular species, its distribution and habitat, its life cycle and life stages, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the important life stages that we have encountered these species in, the predators that feed upon these species, including ourselves, the significance of the species historically and currently with our fishery related to fisheries. So we'll talk about the harvesting of the species, the threats and the management efforts the threats to the species and the management efforts underway. And then of course, those threats and how our conservation strategies are addressing that. So let's jump into just describing and talking a little bit more about this species that we might all know. So queen conchs are easily one of the most recognizable snails in the ocean, on the beach. If you've ever held up that conch shell, or your child has held up that conch shell to hear the ocean, you might have thought that's where that conch the experience for that species begins and ends. But in reality, that's only a tiny glimpse into the story of this beloved marine animal. Because although some people know it, as an animal that inhabits that shell, few are aware of just like how complex the conch's development is. Not to mention how threatened they are and that their populations are really teetering on the brink. Again, this species, it's a slow moving but long-lived marine snail. It's become kind of this symbol or abiding symbol of the, relaxed pace of life maybe here in Florida. Specifically, you can kind of think about the Florida Keys and how, they refer to themselves as the conchs. It really has become this affectionate species, but we know them as that, but there's a lot more to them. So just a little bit about their taxonomy. So again, they're in the phylum Mollusca. They're a gastropod. So they're a large gastropod mollusk. So that belongs to the same family that we have sea snails. And their family is true conchs. So they There's a number of different conchs out there. We'll talk about it on the next slide, but this is one of the larger conchs. The scientific name is Strombidae gigas, but it's known in a lot of different languages and cultures, and it's a big symbol in a lot of those cultures. So let's talk about those true conchs. So those Strombidae family. There are 55 species of conch worldwide. 6 occur in the Caribbean and Florida waters. So we have the hawkwing conch, the milk conch, the Florida fighting conch, the Goliath conch, the rooster tail conch, the West Indian fighting conch, and the queen conch. And of those 6 species, the queen conch is the largest of those 6 that are found in the Caribbean, with its size of its shell growing up to 12 inches. The weight is up to 5 pounds, so these can actually grow pretty large. Some of these adult conch species, the ones that are up at the top of their lifespan, 40 years, can be pretty large in size. And then just right off the bat, we'll mention that this species is listed on the Appendix 2 of the CITES. So that's the trade of endangered species. And so that's an international ordinance that manages those species and illegal trade in that. And that was listed in 1992. And so again, this conch species, because of its uses, has been listed as an endangered, and we will talk about, or is protected, and we will talk about that as we go on. So let's just kind of break it down in terms of what is this animal and what are we looking at. So the queen conch, like all snails, has a foot that actually extends out of the shell. So we all know the shells, but the animal inside is a snail, and it has certain anatomical sections that we can talk about that allow it to kind of move along and do the things that it does. So again, like all snails, the queen conch has a single foot with which it propels itself. So that's this long projection here. In most marine snails, this foot is broad and sturdy. It enables the animal to kind of glide along the ocean bottom smoothly. But the foot of the queen conch is a little different. It's narrow at the end and has this large tough plate. So this darker colored plate that extends from its foot, that's called an operculum. So when the conch, it uses it for a few different things. When the conch wants to move forward, it plants that operculum on the bottom and pushes off like a pole vaulter. And that results kind of in like a jerky lurching motion that some people describe as like a series of grotesque leaps and tumblings. So that's a very descriptive way to describe the movement. But yeah, it basically just propels itself along by pushing itself. And that appendage can also be used in several other ways. A conch can use its operculum for defense. So defense against predators by pulling its body back into the shell and using that operculum almost as like a trap door. And so that can use it as a shield to protect itself from predators. It can also wield that thing as like a club, and it can, kind of try to knock away whatever's trying to attack it. We'll talk about some of the predators that might try to break into that or try to pull the snail out. And so that operculum can be used as a club. And then lastly, we talked about kind of moving. Let's say the conch gets knocked over, flipped on the back of the shell. It can use that operculum to right itself. So it can, almost tip to one side, and the foot contains, it can basically, that operculum can almost be used as like a spring, and it can pop itself right back up. So it's a really useful and flexible tool that this conch can use. So that's really, what's most interesting about the conch, the queen conch. But it also has these eye stalks. So you might be wondering what these alien projections are coming out of its the foot. Those are its eye stalks. So the eyes of the queen conch are more highly developed than other sea snails. It's excellent. It has excellent eyesight, and it's supplemented by the tentacles. So you see these little projections from the eye stalks. So those are used to like feel and taste the water. And so they can definitely use those sensory organs to, kind of look at its surroundings and get an idea of any nearby predators. Another interesting feature of the queen conch anatomy, the blood is actually very, if you were to see a queen conch blood, it's colorless liquid, and it actually contains copper, was something that was very interesting about this when they were researching the species. And so the blood, in the process of respiration, the oxygen of this animal, it turns basically the it's called hemocyanin, the blood, making it look like kind of a blue-blooded animal. So it's true blue blood of the animal kingdom. The shell itself is actually pretty striking as well. Adults have a heavy shell with this kind of lip to it. So you can see the shell of this animal extends out and kind of covers the entire body, and it kind of has that lip. So the lip of the shell is made of calcium carbonate, so that animal makes that shell, and that lip can be anywhere from a glossy pink to an orange to a yellow, and that's on the interior. And then the outside is usually, if it's not covered in algae or growth, it's kind of that brown papery color, and that can collect again bacteria, algae, that helps disguise the animal in its habitat. What's interesting also about conchs and other snails is they can be left-handed or right-handed. So that relates to how, if you were holding that in your hands, your right hand fits into actually a queen conch shell easier than your left. And so the queen conchs are right-handed, have right-handed shells, which is pretty interesting. And so the queen conch shell, again, can grow up to 12 inches, and it can be, again, 5 pounds in weight. So that shell is really, really strong. And so those queen conch, they can live up to 40 years. And so those shells kind of grow with them. And we'll talk kind of about how at different stages, the shells kind of look different, and they don't have that lip until they're much larger in age. So they can increase their shell length by as much as 3 inches a year during their active growing stage, so between their juvenile and adult stage. And then after the animal attains its sexual maturity, its shell continues to thicken, but its lengthwise growth, kind of stops. So those are kind of the main, features of this organism. And, the conch, it's an invertebrate, so it has that soft body. And it's all those internal organs are enclosed by this, fleshy covering. That's called the mantle. And so that actually secretes what the shell is made of, and houses the gills and whatnot to allow the conch to extract the oxygen from the water. So that's kind of how it is made up. So moving on to the range of this species. So queen conch are, as you can see by this graphic, are found throughout the Caribbean. They're found all the way up off of the coast of Bermuda, down through the Bahamas, off the coast of Florida, and then throughout the Caribbean archipelago and into the southern Caribbean Ocean. They're usually found in shallow, warm waters. So usually in areas that are not too deep, not basically deep enough where the sunlight can still penetrate pretty deep into the benthic community, into the bottom. They've been found in waters all the way out to 500 feet deep, but for the most part, they're in waters ranging from 1 to 50 feet deep. And despite, again, they move slowly. We talked about that operculum. Despite their slow speed, they can wander for, miles on end over the course of a couple days. And that's for the forage for their food. So they're herbivores. They feed on things like seaweed, algae encrusted rocks, and decaying organic matter. And in Florida, the queen conch are actually most abundant in the Florida Keys, but are occasionally found as far north as, the Panhandle region. But for the most part, they like that warm, shallow water that we're going to find kind of here off of the southeast coast, and along the southwest coast as well. We see them actually here in Miami-Dade County, off the coast of Key Biscayne. Those waters off Key Biscayne are pretty shallow, and those seagrass beds within Biscayne Bay are really important for them as well. So a little bit more about that habitat. So the adults and the juveniles prefer different areas. So the adults are most numerable in areas where there's, kind of right off the reefs. So they're in areas where there's coral rubble, or areas where that coral has been kind of scattered across. So there's some hard bottom. And then also in areas where you do actually have reef structure. Here, as an example, here on Key Biscayne, we have our fossilized mangrove reef on the northern end of the island. They enjoy that habitat because it's at hard bottom, but there's seagrass communities just nearby, which is where they forage. They forage in those sandy bottom and seagrass beds. From April to October, the adult conch actually do gather to spawn offshore. So what they'll do is they'll move off of those shallow bottom, those shallow water habitats and closer to the reefs, which is where they'll form larger colonies to spawn. And the large shell of the queen conch, can also provide habitat for a number of other species. So we actually do sometimes see, other animals that use the queen conch as a mobile home. Things like slipper limpets, which is like another type of smaller snail. We have things like the cardinal fish, which has a nickname called the conch fish because they like to kind of spend time in those little nooks and crannies on the outside, kind of near the lip of the shell, and that they can hide both in the in the shells as well as in and around those shells. It's kind of this habitat for a number of other little species. There's also a small crab that actually finds it comfortable to live between the operculum, or the foot of the snail, and the shell itself. So that's kind of interesting. They just kind of wedge themselves in there. So it's obviously a species that plays a role in the community as well. So that's kind of the habitat. And again, these shallow water areas are both accessible for predators as well as humans. So that's why we often encounter these species in the environment. So let's talk a little bit more about the life cycle of the queen conch, and kind of go through the different stages. So conch begin their life as creatures so small that they can only really be seen with a microscope. The conch larvae are called veligers, so Veliger, and they really bear no resemblance to that final form. So here in this veliger larvae stage, they have like two wing-like lobes that cover this little body, with cilia, those little hairs that are sticking off of it that help it move in the water. And this tiny transparent shell, this little brown part of this larvae, that eventually becomes the mature queen conch shell. So these larvae will, in that 3 to 5 days from hatching, they will actually just float in the water column for about 21 to 30 days, just drifting in those ocean currents. They feed on tiny little one-celled plants called phytoplankton, and eventually they'll actually settle to the seafloor. From there, those lobes, these little swimming lobes, disappear, and they start to develop this foot, and the operculum starts to develop. Within a month of settling on that floor, they start to metamorphosize, and the animal begins to take on an appearance of the adult conch in miniature. So basically it has that secreted shell, which is, again, liquid calcium carbonate that hardens into crystals and then hardens into that material that builds that tough shell. So conchs measure about 3 inches in length at 1 year of age. And so at that 1 year of age, they're advancing about 6 inches by that second year. So 3 inches in the first year, and then 6 inches by the second year. And they call these young conchs rollers, because their shells really don't have any stable flaring lip that can, hold them in place. So they're just kind of rolling there in the surf. And you can kind of see by this picture here, it kind of almost looks like the lip of the adult got cut off, but that's just the stage that it's in of development. And so if you ever find these, again, they're going to be smaller than the adults, but they have this lip missing. So, they're feeding on the seafloor at this point on algae, decaying plant matter, maybe seagrass blades. And when that shell is about 12 inches long, the lip actually begins to form. So then you have, it's basically stopped growing in size and it's just growing in that on the lip. So that's really how you can kind of tell the life stage or the age of that conch shell is by that lip. And as that process occurs, the conch is directing its energy, again, getting heavier, getting the lip getting thicker. They're usually doing that in that offshore area and moving inshore as they grow older as adults to those areas we talked about as their adult habitat. But some of the populations here in Florida actually developed their flared lip a little earlier than other populations in the Caribbean. So there's some diversity, which is interesting in some of these populations. And that could just be because of what they're feeding on or their growth rate in terms of the calcium carbonate process. So that's really interesting. And then, we go to the mating stage. Once they become sexually mature, the females the queen conch females will typically mate in the spring to early fall in those shallow sandy areas. And during the mating, the male usually sits behind the female, deposits the sperm, and then the female retains that sperm for several weeks. And then they spawn 6 to 8 times during that spawning season. So what they produce are these egg casings that are pretty inconspicuous. And those egg casings, there can be about 400,000 embryos in that egg casing. So it's this gelatinous tube full of embryos. And so again, to complete the cycle, 4 to 5 days, those embryos emerge and those veligers come out. So very few actually do survive to adulthood. And why is that? Well, that's because they look like great little food for a lot of predators on our benthic communities. So we have predators of these small swimming veligers and even these juvenile conchs are things like our loggerhead sea turtle. They love to prey on both the adults and the juveniles. Things like crabs, sharks, rays, both our southern stingrays as well as the spotted eagle rays. And then even things like pufferfish, grouper, octopus. So a number of species. And then of course, we also have carnivorous gastropods. So other mollusks that do like to feed on queen conchs, which is pretty interesting that we have conch on conch predation. So this image here is actually taken off Key Biscayne. This is of a horse conch. So this is one of the largest marine snails. They will attack and basically rip out the queen conch from its shell. So very strong, have a very strong foot operculum to do that. But really when they're adults, it's loggerhead sea turtles, the horse conch, and the rays that can really get into those shells, bust open those shells and get that animal out. Whoops. So those are the predators. And then of course, I'd be remiss not to mention us. We are one of the largest predators and consumers of this animal. So that's where I'd like to kind of go next with this presentation, is just talk a little bit more about the historical significance of the queen conch, not just here in South Florida, but across the Caribbean. So queen conch have been part of the human diet for centuries. Really the prehistoric peoples, if we're talking here in South Florida, the Calusa and the Tequesta, who lived in South Florida around 3,000 years ago, they ate a ton of conch meat and used the shells for all sorts of different things. So use them to make cooking utensils, pots, as well as jewelry, necklaces, earrings, all sorts of things that they could wear. And then those shells could actually be functioned as, ceremonial items, things like trumpets, and even, you know, we've seen uses of that today, that same use for those Floridians with an interest in unusual musical instruments, or even the curious kid. You know, those are used for those purposes as well. But really, they were sought after for their meat. So the Calusa were the kind of the largest tribe occupying South Florida. And they were a non-agricultural tribe. They were more of a hunting and gathering tribe. And they were primarily a fishing-based community. So, you know, prior to, you know, some of our more recent Native American tribes, such as the Seminoles, these folks were fishing and really combing those areas across Southwest Florida for all sorts of species, and really the queen conch was a main staple of their diet. And what was interesting was, you can see in this image here, this mound. And so prior to countries like China or the United Arab Emirates, who build islands out in the ocean, they were really the first ones to kind of construct man-made islands, you know, kind of out in these shallow water areas that they foraged in. And this is a diagram of Mound Key. So Mound Key was on the west coast of Florida in Estero Bay, and it was believed to have been their ceremonial circle, so their ceremonial center for all of their activity. Again, those populations at that time were pretty large and were across that region. And Mound Key is really rich in that history. And the island was developed by these Calusa by piling up their discarded conch shells. So, you know, we've heard of what are called shell middens, M-I-D-D-E-N. And these are basically places where, you know, these tribes would discard all of their, you know, their heaps of scraps. So their shells, bones, other objects like, you know, scraps from building. So it was a mound that was created by these primarily conch shells. And they basically took this mangrove island, this flat island, and turned it into this mound where they could basically be, you know, construct their shelter and be above the water line, which is interesting. So they, you know, were engineering to help with these, you know, crazy tides and even sea level rise before it, you know, was exacerbated in this century. So by running a series of carbon dating in that area, they were able to measure the amount of, you know, fragments from these shells and the age, and it dated back to, you know, that early time. And this population, you know, it really surprised a lot of the European colonists that came to Florida, most notably the Spanish in 1513. You know, Ponce de Leon was, you know, was writing about, you know, these engineering feats that the Calusa, you know, were constructing. So that was really interesting. And those European explorers also, you know, started to take those conch shells home with them. They quickly became, you know, a coveted novelty, and, you know, they adorned fireplaces and garden edges, and, you know, kind of made their way across the Caribbean and across the Atlantic. And even still, they were ground down into, you know, fine material to make porcelain, you know, or again, to make, you know, building materials. So these conch shells were used as tons of foundations for roadbeds as well. So very historically significant item and shell and animal. And so we'd be remiss not to notice how, you know, how much ingenuity these Calusa people had, and use these conch shells for all sorts of different purposes. And I did also want to mention a pretty interesting fact about conchs. Did you know that about 10,000 conchs, 1 in 10,000 conchs contain a pearl? So it's not just oysters that, you know, possibly might contain a pearl. There's actually this rare pearl that forms within the conch's mantle. So again, that's its body. And it's they're kind of pink or brown sometimes with like a flame-like stratiation in it. And they're a huge demand by jewelers, and they're across the Caribbean. So not many people knew that conchs have pearls. And again, the color kind of fades with time. But they're pretty rare, 1 in 10,000. So kind of an interesting fact about conchs that some people might not know. So that was kind of the historical significance. Of course, these Calusa folks and even the early European settlers harvested these conchs, but it's really turned into quite the industry. So, queen conchs, are currently harvested commercially in more than 20 countries. And they're, again, fished primarily for food, but also for bait. Sometimes they use the meat of that animal for bait. And then, of course, the conch shells are generally, considered a byproduct by the fishing industry, but they're, sold as curios or used in jewelry, again, for, the purposes of those collector shops. In addition to the domestic demand for conch meat, there's also a substantial international market, as we all know, as we've all tried a variety of conch fare, and that really drives the conch harvest. It's long been a staple food in the Caribbean. Its meat, can be grounded or pounded, marinated in lime juice, made tender. There's all sorts of different culinary delights made with conch, and it's really a huge staple in the Caribbean. In Florida, really in the early years, they were harvested more for the collectible item, but also for that harvest, just not in the quantities that we saw in some of these other Caribbean nations. And then in 1965, there was a law that mandated that fishermen utilize the meat as well as the shell. So when they were first seeking them out for that collectible shell, there was a law that asked, anyone that harvested them had to use the meat as well. So this really kind of pushed that industry, that fishery, in the States. And the fishermen, their techniques to harvest in the early days, they'd take out small dinghies or glass, and have glass bottom buckets, and they'd kind of just scan the bottom from their dinghies, and then free dive down and collect those animals. Or sometimes they'd use long hooked poles to kind of pull them up. And those were kind of the easiest ways to harvest them in those days. And then they'd bring them to port, they'd bring them to shore, clean them out, and they'd knock a hole in there, and then pull out the animal and insert the knife in the top of the shell, pull the animal out, and then discard the shell. So you'd have these huge mounds of discarded shells, again, reminiscent of those shell middens, along some of our our ports and our harbors. This was a huge industry in the Florida Keys, of course, and so all across the Keys you'll see those remnants of that industry and those harvests. Now, about just to give you an idea of how much of that meat is actually edible, it's about 1/5 to 1/3 of the weight of that adult conch. So a pretty sizable portion for the catch effort. And then, so those were those early days. Of course, again, there was that law that mandated them utilizing the meat. And then there became that advent of the scuba diving, or the popularity of scuba diving. And that really made harvesting of conch a lot easier. And by 1966, between 200,000 and 250,000 conch were landed in Key West, just in Key West, per year. So that was really a booming industry, fishery, in the 1960s through the 1970s and 80s. And of course, as that industry, not just in Florida, but across the region, it boomed. By 1990s, the late 1990s, the global conch market was estimated at about US 60 million per year. So that's a pretty large industry. And then even today, in the late 2010s, the fishing industry was actually the second largest benthic fishing industry. So that's referring to collecting of fish, of a fishery of an animal on the benthic on the bottom. That's second to spiny lobster. So spiny lobster being the largest benthic fishing industry, and then the queen conch. So that's quite a bit. And the fishing industry actually, if we're to look at it, kind of across the Caribbean, it accounts for up to 8% of the Caribbean territory's gross domestic product. So it's a very crucial, very important economic driver. And it's a significant contributor to, a lot of these small island economies. And so with that, it creates a lot of jobs. There's a lot of revenue generation in not just the harvesting, but the processing, the marketing of these industries for conch products, conch, dishes, things of that nature. So it's really, become quite an industry. And with that, of course, has become, it's become a fishery that's become overharvested. And we've seen a decline in these populations during these decades through today. And so coupled with, illegal trade, poaching, it really makes the conch a particularly vulnerable fishery, and one that we definitely want to talk more about. So, with that kind of historical significance in mind, and with the history of that fishery, let's talk about some of the current threats to this industry, and focus really on that conch harvesting. So again, they're harvested for the meat as well as the shells, the second largest benthic fishery in the Caribbean behind spiny lobster. So with that industry, we have a lot of overharvesting, and it's because it's been because of mismanaged fisheries and mismanaged resources. So one of the biggest threats is that overharvesting. So the harvesting of the conch at a rate that is faster than they can be replenished by reproduction. So a number of biological factors, as we discussed earlier with the life cycle of the species, really render this conch particularly vulnerable to overfishing, including the factors including species having a slow growth. We talked about how long it takes for those those veligers to grow to that adult conch and then to reach sexual maturity. So that late maturation, it's limited mobility, so they really can't move great distances. And then the occurrence in shallow waters, so the accessibility, and then the tendency to aggregate when they are mating, can really lead to an overharvesting and a mismanagement of that fishery. For example, in a country such as the Bahamas, where 15% of the population either work full-time or part-time in that fisheries sector, the livelihoods of approximately 9,000 fishermen are under threat if the queen conch populations actually decline. So it's definitely an industry that some nations have mismanaged, and therefore have put their populations at risk. But not just their queen conch populations, but their local populations at risk as well. So the current demand for conch meat actually grossly exceeds the supply across the region, across the Caribbean, and the queen conch populations are steadily being depleted. And in addition to higher landings than what was historically sustainable, the use of the dive gear and the modern practices, have really led to, kind of a lack of enforcement being put in place to kind of keep up with all of these new ways to harvest them, and these new areas in which they can kind of harvest in. So there's a lot of different factors that contribute to that over harvesting, but it really continues to be the single greatest threat to that species. And we'll talk about some of the regulations that are insufficient to check that over harvesting. Another topic related to harvesting is of juveniles. So that's more of the taking of these animals before they are sexually mature. So it's when they're being taken when they have a thin lip. So remember those roller conchs, those young conchs, and they're not mature enough to reproduce. So obviously that can lead to issues with the depletion of that next generation of conch. So that's another big issue related to over harvesting. Then we talk about kind of the lack of enforcement. So there are currently no regional organizations within the Caribbean region responsible for that responsible management of conservation of queen conch resources. So really there's not a governing body that can oversee kind of these species and how they're being harvested on a regional scale. Individual countries do have and have implemented a range of different regulatory mechanisms. We'll talk about that on the next slide in terms of what these individual countries have in place. But there are two principal international measures that do protect these species. One of them being the SPA, which is the Protocol of Cartagena Convention. And so that's a regional or international rather protocol that does protect these species, as well as CITES. So we mentioned CITES. That's the conservation, of the trade of endangered species. So that is one that has been put in place by the United States and is recognized by the United States. So there's been a range of bilateral and regional meetings held by different organizations, but again, there's no regional overseeing body for this species. And then another threat is unregulated fishing. So that's related to illegal fishing. So that's fishing in regions that are, not overseen by a governing body, and it's difficult to monitor, these regions. There's not good enforcement in those regions, and management isn't really able to tell where these landing sites are, where they're bringing these conch ashore once they're fishing. So unregulated fishing and then lack of enforcement in regulated areas are two that are kind of tied together in terms of trying to manage these species in the region itself. A big one that we talk about in terms of the habitat is the loss of this important habitat that these conchs depend on for growth and survival. So they require, as we remember, a ton of habitat types. So things like seagrass beds, open water, sandy bottom, reefs. Loss of these habitats due to human activities, things like coastal construction, dredging. It's really causing the decline of the species because they're not able to make it through their entire life stage. So there really needs to be adequate, healthy seagrass beds for these populations to sustain themselves. And again, seagrass beds are under threat not just by coastal construction and dredging, but things like prop scarring from boats, point and non-point source water pollution. So, suspended sediments that cause the water clarity to be rather poor. And then also degradation can be, because of, unsustainable fishing practices or fishing practices that create damage to the bottom. Things like bottom nets and trawlers and things like that can really destroy those habitats. So loss of habitat is definitely a large factor when it comes to not just the conservation, but some of the research that goes into these species. And then we talk about some of these fishery regulations specifically in individual countries. So they're very subjective. So most of the regulations that permit the harvest of these conchs legally dictate that the conch must have a well-formed lip. So that means it has to be at that stage of maturity that allows it to, sexually reproduce. And so the well-formed, the language that's used in a lot of these fisheries regulations can be subjective. Public misconceptions can cause, some people to believe that the size, is different. And, sometimes they don't use strong, numbers to back up their term well-formed lip. So that can really lead to, issues with take of those conch that ends up being illegal. And like people, conch can also show genetic variation and they can mature at different stages. We talked about the ones in Florida that can grow a little quicker. So, they can vary greatly in size and growth rates. And then lastly on here, I have climate change. So climate change definitely has an impact. Most notably, it has to do with the animal's ability. We talked about how they build their shell out of calcium carbonate. With changing pH levels of the ocean, it can make it much more difficult for these animals to build calcium carbonate shells. So habitat loss due to climate change can also be, related to that as well. We talked about some of the issues with, the seagrass beds and the reefs being impacted by climate change. So those are some of the big threats, and we'll continue to further elaborate on the topic of these fishery regulations. I wanted to show you, as I mentioned, those individual management efforts across the Caribbean related to those fisheries or related to that fishery. So you can kind of see by this graph some of the different management efforts and some of the fishery regulations that are in place. So they have to do with the lip of the shell. Some of them have to do with the shell length. And then, they permit only certain gear to be used to harvest them. So in the Bahamas, you can't use scuba. Same with the Turks and Caicos. There's obviously seasons in some places that have been proposed or are in place in order to protect those specific populations. So you can see across the board, there's a range of management efforts. There's harvest quotas as well. So, and then how many conch can be exported from their country. So across the board, again, there's those individual management efforts, but there still is there's no regional management effort that's kind of overseeing or enforcing some of these regulations. So given these threats and some of these regulations and the issue of overharvesting, what can be done, what research is being done to understand the dynamics of these populations and their barriers to recovery? There are a number of studies underway across the Caribbean that are looking at these short-term and long-term trends and the population ecology to better understand the life cycle and to better inform management and policy. So some of the desired outcomes from this research effort is to establish, kind of the life cycle of these different populations and how they differ, and that can help inform, protected areas or protective measures to better protect these individual populations, as well as the populations across the region. It's also research looking at breeding populations in captivity. So looking at how we can seed the wild populations by lab raising some of these species and pilot some of these commercial industry aquaculture for conch, and looking at how these can help the wild populations as well, but also kind of rebuild the conch stocks while providing that sustainable seafood through the establishment of those aquaculture initiatives. I want to bring up one in particular study that is looking at the population here in Florida. So the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, they've been studying methods to restore the conch populations to more sustainable levels here in the state of Florida. And they're first looking at examining these species in the hatchery and then releasing them into the wild under optimal conditions. So they're looking at how these populations are doing in a controlled environment, and then how that can be kind of utilized on a mass scale, and looking at how these research efforts can maybe help other regions within or other countries within the region to restore their populations as well. So the researchers found that one of the best reproduction or restoration strategies rather is to grow these or to seed these populations offshore by taking them off of these areas that are degraded and moving them to areas that are more in better condition or more protected, and then seeing how they do. So that the conch population in Florida has really been decimated because of, even though we have those measures in place to prevent harvesting, they're really looking at how degraded habitat can, accelerate kind of the decline of populations. So that's a really interesting study that hopefully they can supplement across the region. And just to give you an idea of what the population currently is in Florida, there's estimated to be about 200,000 individual adult conchs in the region. So obviously, that's a smaller sample size, and they can kind of, use those research efforts to kind of seed that population and then, scale that up to larger populations across the Caribbean. They've also been utilizing tracking studies. So they've been using sonic tags that emit sounds when these conch actually move. So they look at how these conch, they're looking at that life stage where the conchs move offshore to reproduce or to mate. And so that's showing them a little bit more about that. That was an area of the life cycle that they were didn't have a lot of data or research on. So they're actually using tracking studies to look at that. And again, that actually gives them an idea about the habitat usage as well. So that can help protect and inform, protections and protected areas, creation of protected areas for these species. So that's one specific research study. I want to kind of go into these conservation strategies that I mentioned and how that research is informing that. So there's a few specific conservation strategies that are being used. I mentioned aquaculture. So that's also known as aqua farming. So it's the rearing of those animals from the egg to the adult for food and for stock enhancement. So through that aquaculture, the queen conch can be harvested, both for human consumption without removing those individuals from the wild. And then those farmed queen conch can also be researched and used to restock wild populations, like I mentioned with that research effort. And the desired outcomes obviously would be to establish those queen conch for education, conservation, restoration, and then that sustainable seafood. Obviously, aquaculture, there are some drawbacks, in terms of the scale, in terms of the effort that needs to go into the building and the management of those aquaculture pens, those stocks. Some of those aquaculture operations, may use these, aqua pens, which is, putting these queen conchs, out into the native habitat, but they'd have to create those controlled environments. So, there's some drawbacks to aquaculture, but it's an area that they're looking into in terms of helping to, sustain those wild populations. There's one such operation I want to mention that is successfully farming these conchs, and that's a partnership between FAU Harbor Branch, so FAU here in South Florida, that are working with a Puerto Rican conservation group and a local fishing organization. So they're bringing in the different stakeholders, and it's working under a NOAA grant to farm conch for release into the wild. And they're farming these queen conch by taking the egg masses, incubating them in the hatchery, and then allowing those the free swimming larvae to live in these hatchery larval tanks. So these pens where they can kind of settle on the bottom, and then from there they can kind of raise them up, and that can provide a better understanding of how these aquaculture operations in the the native environment can help to both research how these growth rates are different between wild and native, and hopefully that can inform better management practices moving forward. And also these outplanted conchs, once they mature, can hopefully seed the population by they can find a mate and produce that next generation of queen conch. So that's a really interesting strategy that's being implemented and utilizing stakeholders across that region, and so that way the fisheries are also involved in the process. Of course, we talked about marine protected areas as a conservation strategy. Those are also being looked at. There was a study that was published in 2017 in Conservation Science and Practice that looked at an MPA that's in existence in the Bahamas called the Exuma Cays Land and Sea Park. And it's looking at conch reproduction. And the results showed that conchs within a well-enforced MPA reproduce and replenish the populations spilling outside of the protected area. So they're replenishing nearby populations as well as the ones within the protected area. So obviously this is, a strategy that can really be, helpful for, even if you have, it's very difficult to create, large marine protected areas, but if you can create a network within a region or within a country's boundaries, you can really, help seed the populations nearby and help create a healthy, thriving fishery. So, those larvae can really move across the currents outside of those boundaries to really, provide stability in that population. And of course, when we talk about MPAs, we also have to talk about proper enforcement, the designing of proper enforcement and funding, and the including of the local stakeholders in order to make that MPA the most effective that it can be. So there's definitely some factors to take into consideration when you talk about creating MPAs, and there's definitely, it's a difficult process, but if we can create small ones that can help, the populations across the region. And then lastly, there's a couple, we talked a lot about the stronger fishing regulations and enforcement, but one of the things that's gotten some, traction by a few different groups is listing the queen conch on the endangered species list. So again, it's protected by CITES, which is, an international convention, but creating, endangered species protection can really benefit the species. So there's existing regulatory measures, that have been deemed insufficient. By listing the queen conch as threatened or endangered, we can really provide regulation that prevents exploitation of the species. So, endangered species list really gives it a lot of protections. It would prohibit the import or export of queen conch into the US. And that's really big because the US is the world's largest importer of queen conch. So by limiting or restricting that importation to the US, we really can stop a lot of this overfishing or illegal harvest, as which is happening across the region. And that can really be more effective than any other regulatory mechanism. And then in addition to listing it, it would ensure and providing that protection to the species, it would also ensure adequate habitat protection. So there's a designation that needs to be, when a species is listed, it designates a critical habitat for that species. So that would identify areas that needed to be protected for that species, to both for its reproductive life stage as well as its feeding grounds. So that would really provide the impetus for marine protected areas and creating areas in which we can protect the habitat of that species. And listing it on the Endangered Species Act would really encourage international efforts to protect this species through its financial and technical assistance, and also developing conservation programs related to that, and really helping with law enforcement. There's a lot of law enforcement that goes with a endangered species designation. So that is one of the other conservation strategies that's gained a little bit of traction recently. So through those conservation strategies, we're looking to both, create opportunities to protect these populations and help them rebound, while also managing those fisheries better. And then also designating better protections under international, regional, and local regulations and enforcement, that can provide a more sustainable fishery moving forward. And those are some of the conservation strategies that are underway across the Caribbean. So those are, a little bit more about the queen conch, and hopefully that gives you a better understanding of this species, and how it's really something that we love to eat, we love to collect, but it's a very fascinating animal, and it's something that we, hopefully can continue to keep, as part of our diet, but as also something that can be beneficial to the environment and to its species and the habitats they live in. So with that, I want to just go to an easy poll. This is just a demographic poll that helps us get a better understanding of how today's program may have benefited you. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes, there's 3 questions, so just scroll down. Thank you, Anna, for launching that. The first question is really looking at your level of agreement as to how much you learned today. The second question just asks you about how many people were watching with you, in the room with you. That includes yourself. And then lastly, where you're coming from today and where you're joining us from, again, either from Miami-Dade County, somewhere in Florida, elsewhere in the US, or elsewhere in the world. So I'll give it a few seconds to answer that. And this is a good time also to put any questions that you might have. We do have a few more minutes here. If you do have to leave, that's fine, but we'll take some time for questions as well.
All right, thanks so much, Ed. I'm going to leave that poll going, so that way people can take the opportunity and complete it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for that.
Ed, that was a really fascinating presentation. I particularly enjoyed the historical information that you shared with us.
Thanks, Anna. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was definitely interesting to learn about this species, not just in its current context, but really get an understanding of how important it was, to so many of our, native peoples, and predecessors.
Definitely. Well, folks, it's just about 7 o'clock, so if you have to leave, no worries. We're going to stay on to answer some questions with Ed at this time. As a reminder, we did record the webinar, so we'll be sharing that link within the next week. And we hope that you'll join us for our next conversation, which will be Wednesday, November, shoot, I had it in front of me.
November 13th.
November 13th with Keisha Williams, who will be presenting on environmental justice.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's November 10th. November 10th.
I was Ed, confusing me. So we will see you then, and we're going to invite Ed to go ahead and answer some questions.
Sure.
Ed, we
And
had
I
a
will
question.
pop on my screen too so that you all can see.
Great.
Does anyone else see? I think there was some drawing on
Yeah,
the screen. I don't know how we can remove
someone
that.
was playing with the annotate tool.
That's
so
all right.
I'll work on
Someone was
that.
so excited that they wanted to
And
write
we
their
had a
answer.
question really early on in the presentation from Jewel, and it was referring to that biology, the morphology diagram of the
Anatomy of the
conch.
snail. Let me see if
Anatomy,
I can
thank
go
you.
back to that slide.
And she was asking, what is a conch pistil? And where is it on the diagram?
So the conch pistil